South China Morning Post, 6 October 2022, Philippines. Imee Marcos presents her foreign policy and position on the South China Sea at a U.S. seminar. Making the best of the circumstances, Marcos is attempting to obtain funding from China and the U.S. The Philippines are still the most significant loser, as China has already taken control of essential islands and paid off numerous Filipino ministers. Imee Marcos, a senator from the Philippines, said emphatically last week at the presentation of her nation's 7-point plan for foreign policy in front of U.S. government representatives and envoys from other embassies, "Do not make us pick between the U.S. and China." In the address, the sister of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. also demanded that two defense agreements between the U.S. and the Philippines be re-examined and that new trade prospects be expanded. Imee is the most recent member of the Marcos family to work in international relations, while her mother, Imee Marcos, the 93-year-old former First Lady of the Philippines, continues to welcome important Chinese officials who fly into the nation. Her cousin Jose Manuel Bay Romualdez serves as the Philippine ambassador to the United States. "China cannot find a greater champion than my mother in the Philippines," said Marcos Jr. last year. During her visit to Washington, Marcos made the wrong decision to particularly advocate a softer line on the maritime issues, according to a source present at the September 26 forum hosted by the U.S.-Philippine Society and the Southeast Asia Forum of the Stimson Center. Her 7-point plan's main focuses were investigating regional multilateral defense agreements, expanding new trade prospects, granting access to deep-sea fishing, and working together to implement the 2022 CHIPS Act. While praising the U.S. Agency for International Development and U.S. Public Health Service for their work in disaster relief, she also called for improvements in social protections and public safety nets. Engagement with China, including collaborative development, confidence-building measures, and a code of behavior in the South China Sea was the penultimate recommendation in her strategy. While illegitimately holding a Philippine-owned island in the South China Sea, China has been harassing and sinking Filipino fishing vessels. According to media accounts, she told the audience that she had given her proposal to her brother but omitted to mention what the president thought of it. After publicly criticizing Enrique Manalo for filing too many diplomatic protests against the Chinese Coast Guard and fishing vessel violations in the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ, Marcos gave her speech a month later. During the meeting her committee held on September 8, she had questioned Secretary Manalo, asking, "What's the sense of sending hundreds and hundreds of protests with no apparent success?" Manalo responded that Manila needed to state its assertion of sovereign rights officially. The 2016 arbitral ruling invalidated China's 9-line claim to practically all the South China Sea, including a sizable portion of Manila's seas. The fact that China continues to ignore all of these issues is disgusting. Loss of respect and dignity is the result of this. In the same hearing, she told Manalo, "This doesn't appear good for us. The Philippines must have the ability to resist Chinese control." The Washington Forum was not live-streamed or filmed, despite being described as a private event, according to the same source who spoke on anonymity. Members of the U.S. Institute for Peace and Asia Foundation, supported by the U.S. federal government, the U.S. ASEAN Business Council, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and the Center for a New American Security, two think tanks, were also present. Imee Marcos' address, according to the senator's own news release from October 2, did not mince words. The U.S.-Philippine Society issued a second press release pointing out that Marcos' comments reflected recent statements made by her brother regarding the importance of enhanced bilateral ties with the U.S. to the future administration. Also stating that the Philippines should open the door to broad engagement with China, the senator emphasized that Southeast Asian countries prefer a rational approach in relations between Washington and Beijing, not a return to the melodrama of the Cold War, so, do not make us choose between China and the US. Marcos later clarified that she was not calling for a rewrite of the MDT or VFA, but an evaluation of how the wording in both accords is executed, rather than calling for a re-examination of the 1951 U.S.-Philippine Mutual Defense Treaty and the Visiting Forces Agreement. The progress on implementing the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement was another thing she was interested in. Laura Baja, a retired Philippine UN permanent representative the Chinese government once employed, said he advocated revisiting the military accords with the U.S., particularly EDCA, which enables U.S. access to the Philippine bases, which effectively makes them U.S. bases. Baja, a former UN Security Council president, said the senator's proposed international defense agreement would not succeed because ASEAN, especially Indonesia, is not enthusiastic on the notion. He also cautioned that the Code of Conduct version supported by China might end up being a Trojan horse. He claimed that China had spoken out against the inclusion of so-called non-regional powers, mention of the Hague Award and enforcement clauses. An Asian-China Code of Conduct, which Beijing had been stalling on by claiming it would support only when the time is appropriate, was offered as a higher priority by Baja.